All right, slavery in the American colonies. So, how does slavery develop? Well, there are economic factors that contribute to slavery in the American colonies' development. Primarily, there is a real need for labor in the production of rice, even some sugar, and tobacco. There's no real slavery in England at this time, but the English saw the success of slave labor in those Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Caribbean and Latin America. Before 1680, there is a really low number of slaves. The first slaves arrive in North America in 1619, but that number remains really, really small until before 1680. And that's mainly because the sugar that was being produced in the Caribbean is being produced at such a low cost that nobody in North America is even considering trying to compete with the Caribbean sugar plantations. In Britain, a charter is granted to the Royal African Company, and this company is a slaving company. Its goal is to meet the growing colonial demand for slave labor, and over a very short amount of time, it quickly becomes the strongest European slave trading company. There are also demographic factors, primarily that Native Americans were dying. Native Americans who had been used for labor were not surviving long enough to make that viable. And the number of white indentured servants, the number of people willing to come over to the New World and work for 6, 7, 9 years, that supply is being exhausted. There are fewer and fewer people willing to subject themselves to indentured servitude. We've talked about how migrants from Barbados to the Carolinas brought not only their slaves, but the whole slave plantation system. So that's definitely a factor. Those people coming to the New World or coming to North America definitely contributes to slavery in the British colony or the American colonies. There's also a decent climate for growing a number of cash crops like tobacco, like rice, and even in some parts of Georgia and eventually in Florida, growing sugar. Also, there's a healthier climate in the earlier 1700s and a better diet for people, and that means a better birth rate. So in the early 1700s, the slave birth rate is finally exceeding the slave death rate. African slaves were well suited to the climate of the Caribbean and the American South, unlike maybe some white indentured servants. And the diet that they were given really helps with their survival rate as well. We're not saying that they enjoyed the best food or the best diet or the most nutritious diet, but it was at least enough to keep people alive. So how is slavery justified? How is enslaving an entire race of people justified? Well, at the time, Europe viewed Africa as a home to heathen religions, religions that weren't really religions. They viewed the people of Africa as barbarians who practiced things like sexual promiscuity and did not believe in things like traditional marriage. They also saw this as a chance to convert them to Christianity. This is seen as more important than their freedom. Saving their eternal soul and giving them Christianity is more important, is justification for enslaving them. At first, only some African slaves are considered property or chattel slaves. Some are just seen as servants, and some could buy their freedom, but eventually all will be seen as chattel slaves, as property. By 1700, slavery in the New World is based entirely on the color of someone's skin. And unfortunately for slaves, Christianity, finding God in the eyes of their white masters, does not in any way, shape, or form lead to any kind of freedom. And slaves of mixed heritage, slaves with maybe one white parent and one black parent, do not have any additional rights. If you have any black ancestors, you are considered a slave. In the Spanish colonies, they had used what they called the casta system, where people of mixed race did have additional rights, but that's not going to be the case in the British colonies. There are strict slave codes drawn up throughout the British colonies and really throughout all of colonial America. And that's really done as the number of slaves becomes more significant. And these are drawn up to make sure slaves don't have a chance to organize and rebel. Within the slave society, there are different types of slaves. There are what are called Creole slaves, and those would have been people born here in the New World. And then there are newly arrived slaves. The size and density of the black population in a colony really determined the level of identity that was maintained. So the slave culture and the slave identity in a place like South Carolina is going to be very different and much stronger than, say, the slave identity and the slave culture in Massachusetts, where there were much, much fewer slaves. This slave culture is going to be a mix of African culture and European culture, but it's also not going to be entirely African or entirely European. It's going to be something new. It's going to be an African American culture. It's going to be a slave culture, very distinct, very different than anything else. One of the areas where that was strongest was in what were called the lowlands of South Carolina. In this region, the purple area along the coast, 60% of the population were slaves. And they lived normally on large plantations that were isolated from other contact. And they often had very limited contact with white Americans. As a result, Creole languages, which were a mix of English and sometimes French or even Spanish and African languages, began to emerge. And one of the most common one is Gula, spelled there right underneath Creole language. The Christianity that these slaves practiced, we'll talk more about later in the year, but it included a lot of music, and folk art is strongly emphasized, and not surprisingly, they really focused on and really enjoyed those stories from the Bible that focused on liberation, like Moses freeing the Jews from Egypt. In the first 20 years of the 1700s, live slave births actually exceeded slave deaths. In other words, there are more slaves born in the American colonies than are brought in. This happens in North America much earlier than it happened in the Caribbean or South America. This is in part to the easier climate in North America. This is in part to the better diet given to slaves in North America. They're still slaves. Life is still horrible, but it's probably a little bit easier to be a slave in South Carolina or Georgia or Virginia than it is to be a slave on a sugar plantation in the Caribbean or in Brazil. In other areas, for example, outside of South Carolina, slaves are in much smaller numbers and they have a lot more contact with whites. And as a result, there's less of a black identity or less of a slave culture or identity that emerges. Many of these slaves come straight from Africa and are forced to learn and speak English, so they have no chance to hold on to their native tongues. So let's talk about slave resistance. Overt methods, like the kind that we'll get to in a moment, were more likely in newly arrived slaves from Africa. Overt methods would include things like running away or assaulting a master or overseer. Some of the most memorable overt methods of resistance were rebellions. And one in particular, the Stono Rebellion, took place in 1739 in South Carolina, where 150 slaves rose up and murdered a number of whites in South Carolina. Now, this revolt was put down, but it really scared a lot of the white plantation owners in the area, and stricter black codes were enforced. Another overt method of slave resistance was to run off and become a sailor. This was an easy way to escape, or easier than some other methods, easy way to escape. And these black sailors served as kind of a bridge between different black communities in the world, in the New World, carrying news of what other Africans and African Americans were enduring in different parts of the world. Another method of slave resistance would be covert methods. These would be ones on the sly, secret ones. So slaves, to avoid work, sometimes might fake illness, or they might just work really, really slow, or they might intentionally break their tools so they can't work. They would sometimes poison the food, and I've got that in quotations because they might, for example, kill all the hogs on a farm with a hard whack to the head and tell the master that maybe the pigs were sick, and the master's not going to want to eat the pigs then, and then the slaves might be able to get them. But poison was also used in the master's food, sometimes to kill them, but sometimes just to make them sick as kind of a way to stick it to the slave masters.